Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your time zone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to American Art Archives in Britain. My name is John Fagg. I'm going to be speaking a little later on this afternoon, but I'm just taking the opportunity to introduce you to an event that's the culmination of a Terra Foundation for American Art funded project that's run at the Courtauld Institute of American Art over the Courtauld Centre for American Art over the last couple of years. I won't give an exact start date on when we began working on this because it was some time ago, and it's been one of those activities that was somewhat impacted by the pandemic, particularly the ways in which that those events prevented us from getting into archives, which are the real point of this activity. What we've done over that period of time, somewhat interrupted, is to produce a series of case studies that look at different aspects of American Art Archives in Britain, and we're going to be presenting those over the next 2 days. The event will run 3 hours today, and then reconvening again at 3 o'clock or just before on Saturday, UK time. Over those 2 days, we're going to have a panel session on each day that will be followed by a 20-minute question and answer session. Today we'll start at about 3:10 and run to 3:50, followed by the Q&A. There'll then be a 20-minute break, after which we're really pleased to be welcoming Michael Leisure from the University of Pennsylvania, who's going to offer a keynote talk that will help us to think more broadly about ideas of archival research in American art. Along the way, on any opportunity, if you're interested in doing so, please do put questions or comments in the chat and we'll have the opportunity to respond to those. I'm going to hand over at this point to Emma Merkling from the Courtauld Institute, who is going to introduce the first session and thus avoid me having to try and introduce myself. So I'll hand over to Emma now.
Thanks, John. And thank you for that introduction. So, as John mentioned, I'll be chairing the first panel. My name is Emma Merkling, and I'm the Terra Foundation postdoctoral fellow here at the Courtauld Centre for American Art. And I have the great pleasure of working specifically on the American Art Archives in UK Collections project. So I'm very excited for today and tomorrow. And yeah, just to reiterate what John mentioned, each paper in this panel will be 20 minutes, and then we'll have a 20-minute Q&A at the end. And please do post your questions in the chat, even as the panelists are giving their papers. And then afterwards, I will moderate, I'll chair the Q&A and read out your questions to the panelists who'll then have a chance to answer. So our first speaker is Dr. John Fagg, who you've just had the pleasure of meeting, with the paper Pop Goes to Wolverhampton. John is Senior Lecturer in American Literature and Culture at the University of Birmingham, and he's the author of On the Cusp, Stephen Crane, George Bellows and Modernism of 2009, and several articles and book chapters focusing on early 20th century American literature and visual arts, including Chamber Pots and Gibson Girls, Clutter and Matter in John Sloane's graphic art. And John has also contributed catalogue essays for exhibitions, including Simple Pleasures, The Art of Doris Lee, and the National Portrait Gallery's The Sweat of Their Face, Portraying American Workers, and has recently completed a second book, Re-envisioning the Everyday American Genre Scenes 1905 to 1945. And as I mentioned, his paper today is Pop Goes to Wolverhampton. So John, are you ready to get started?
Sure, thanks ever so much, Emma. Okay, see if I can share screen. Hopefully we can all see that. Okay, great. Pop Goes to Wolverhampton. The exclamation point there is a gesture to pop art iconography, I'd say, rather than an expression of surprise that pop should find its way to Wolverhampton. The talk explores the early formation of the Wolverhampton Art Gallery pop art collection, focusing on the Warhol, Rosenquist and Lichtenstein acquisitions. It navigates the challenge of a narrow focus on a limited archive to consider American pop art discourse and objects in a British regional gallery. one context for Wolverhampton's acquisitions is the series of London exhibitions from the mid-1960s to the early 1970s that established an American pop art canon and critical framework for British audiences, as documented by the Terra Foundation funded project Modern American Art at Tate 1945 to 1980. These included the ICA's 1963, the Pop Image, and 1968, the Obsessive Image exhibitions, the Hayward Gallery's 1969 Pop Art Survey, which was, according to its catalogue, weighted in favour of pop art, American pop, for which British English public has had almost no first-hand experience, and the Tate's 1968 Roy Lichtenstein, 1970 Claes Oldenburg, and 1971 Andy Warhol shows. The Tate Liechtenstein exhibition was inspired, or in curator Norman Reed's words, occasioned by a retrospective curated by John Coplands at the Pasadena Art Museum. This was not a touring exhibition as such, but rather a model that Tate curators worked from as they worked directly with Liechtenstein and dealers Leo Castelli and Ilana Sonnenbend to put together a show that went on to museums in Amsterdam, Bern, and Hanover. Correspondence in the Tate archives indicates a tension between Castelli, who was not very helpful, as he wanted to send his Liechtenstein works to a show in Cincinnati, and Liechtenstein himself, who was obviously keen to help and will prepare 1967 paintings. Reed suggests that from conversations held in New York City, Liechtenstein was not keen on the idea of Cincinnati, and I thought this was something I must leave for him to argue with Castelli. We might think about the different agendas here. For Liechtenstein, the opportunity to show work in Europe, against Castelli perhaps keen on sending art to an established market likely to generate sales. Liechtenstein's enthusiasm extended to the exhibition catalogue essay written for the I think your essay comes closer to the way I look at my work and much better expressed by you than anything I've read. Therefore, I love it and approve wholeheartedly. Morfitt's focus is tightly on Liechtenstein, making little mention of pop as a movement and attending closely to the formal qualities of the work. After the show closed, Guggenheim curator Dan Waldman wrote to Morfitt asking for a copy, which would in turn inform her major Liechtenstein catalogue. This dialogue suggests the seamless movement of pop art across the Atlantic and between metropolitan centres, as in MoMA's 1966 London, New York, Hollywood, A New Look in Prints exhibition, which posited the distances between the capitals of the world, particularly its swinging cities, have become short indeed. The archival record of Tate's 1971 Andy Warhol exhibition hints at a less smooth transatlantic exchange. This time, Tate worked directly with John Coplands to host a show organised by the Pasadena Art Museum that toured a number of US and European venues. Arrangements were marred by what Coplands described in a memo to his museum director as a perplexing and difficult situation arising from plans for a separate catalogue to accompany the Tate exhibition. And we've got Copland's book and the Tate catalogue on screen here. Having offered various ways of collaborating on a single publication, Copland stated that finally, since they were anxious to write a catalogue interpreting Warhol's work from a purely English viewpoint, we agreed to this arrangement, providing the Tate paid for the cost of the colour plates to be used in this book. In our book, sorry. This created significant tension when it became apparent that Copland's book would be published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson in the UK shortly before the London opening, a publication partly funded by Tate that would potentially cut the sales and significance of its own catalogue. The conflict was resolved, but can still be traced in Norman Reed's awkward thanks to John Coplands for making available some of the material in his forthcoming detailed survey of Warhol's oeuvre. In his foreword, when Moffat's essay quotes and cites Copland's book directly. Given the problems it caused, what was at stake for the Tate in producing its own catalogue on Warhol? Book sales were perhaps a factor, but from the correspondence, the emphasis was on framing the exhibition in a way familiar to Tate audiences as an extension of practices at other recent exhibitions. The purely English viewpoint that Coplands refers to is suggested perhaps, but not prominent, present in direct and indirect ways. Morfitt frames the American pop art of the early 1960s through reference to early developments around the independent group in London, which had not mentioned in Copland's book. And he's careful to characterize Warhol's attention to American everyday culture for British audiences who might not share that familiarity. In fact, he writes, rather than striving to invent remarkable new objects, Warhol chooses subjects that in nearly all cases are readily to hand, especially in food store, newspaper, or magazine, to the vast majority of United States citizens in the course of their normal daily life. As in the Liechtenstein catalogue, Morphet takes a tightly focused formalist approach, deftly identifying formal qualities: deadpan, vivid but bland, passivity, ordinariness, transposition, modularity. He writes, a restless, mutually referring interaction between imagery, mood, interpretation, analogy, material, process, idea, chance, construction, color. This is the major departure from Copland's book, which, especially in New Yorker critic Calvin Tompkins' opening essay, Raggedy Andy, is first named terms informal, personal, anecdotal, and alive to Warhol as the center of the factory in Max's Kansas City scenes. In its formalist presentation, Tate creates what I'd see as a portable Warhol that works to communicate to an international audience, but also lifts him out of the context of the avant-garde, queer, and celebrity New York scene. Both the Liechtenstein and Warhol exhibitions, and I guess Warhol's arrival in London and visit to the Tate exhibition, perhaps reassert that sense of his persona and identity into the context of the exhibition, but it's maybe not there in the catalogue and doesn't travel in the same way. Both the Liechtenstein and Warhol exhibitions were popular with London audiences and noted, sometimes scathingly, as in the Sunday Times critic's observation, that to see some of them marching through the entrance hall, looking neither to left or right, you would think that all older art was contaminated for attracting a new and younger audience. That demographic was caught in filmmaker John Armstrong's Andy Warhol, But the People Are Beautiful, which combined commentary from Morphet, Alvarez and others with an innovative attention to audience, eavesdrop on a conversation, on a cross-section of the beautiful people visiting the gallery, as it was described when the film was shown as part of the BBC's Omnibus strand in 1973. That popularity, demographic and engagement, together with the packaging of an accessible, portable pop art, made works by Warhol and others attractive to regional collections, such as Wolverhampton Art Gallery and its curator, David Rogers. Rogers was appointed as museum director by Wolverhampton City Council in 1969 with a remit to innovate and renovate galleries described by one observer as a rainy day rendezvous for OAPs and teenage sweethearts looking for somewhere to hang out. Quoting from the lively and informative obituary written by his friend, the art historian Hugh Brigstock, Rogers had begun his museum career 4 years earlier at the City of York Art Gallery. A remarkable reference from Cambridge drew attention both to his intellectual potential and his innate laziness, and suggested he might bore himself to death unless he quickly found an absorbing job. This was calculated to appeal to the director at York, Hans Hess, who had long shown a rare ability to appoint talented mavericks in preference to what he perceived as the narrow-minded art historians produced by the Courtauld Institute. Rogers was described in the press as charismatic and as a rebel leader in the arts, and introduced in a Guardian profile as the sort of museum curator prone to attacks from angry old ladies telling him that they were all right before he came and why doesn't he get back to London where he belongs. Maybe the blue corduroy suit, toe-capped shoes and heavy black whiskers do look a little bit metropolitan against the stony pallor of Wolverhampton. That approach helps to explain, and that reputation was bolstered by Rogers' acquisition of Andy Warhol's 1964 silkscreen on canvas Jacqueline in 1972. Spring 1972 could be seen as late in a timeline of pop art, which by the 1970s could be understood as a historical period or practice, but also early in that the acquisition was instigated less than a year after the Tate show, which was framed as an introduction, as introducing Warhol to British audiences, had closed, and in relation to British collections outside London. Rogers applied to the V&A Purchase Grant Fund, the major mechanism through which regional galleries supported acquisitions of this kind. V&A records show that in the same year, Bradford City Art Galleries made successful applications for prints by Roy Lichtenstein, Peace Chemistry, and Robert Rauschenberg, Hybrid pop art through the fund. Galleries in Coventry and Ipswich made unsuccessful applications for works by Lichtenstein and Rosenquist, and Leicester Art Museum purchased a Claes Oldenburg lithograph. But the other applications across the 70s were all from Wolverhampton and included the applications to acquire major works by Rosenquist and Lichtenstein in 1978 and 1979. Wolverhampton was also the only gallery to acquire paintings rather than prints, and to bid for funds in the thousands rather than the hundreds of pounds. In the case of Liechtenstein's purist painting with bottles of 1975, an application for matched funding of over £17,000. These outlier acquisitions were facilitated by Roger's understanding of the institutional contexts of regional galleries under local council control, gained while working with Hess in York, and his metropolitan connections that included friendship with artists such as Don Besant and Tony Messenger, and London curators, most significantly Michael Levy, as well as relationships with London commercial galleries. The Warhol was acquired from London Art Gallery on New Bond Street, the Rosenquist from Petersburg Press of Portobello Road, and the Lichtenstein from Waddington Galleries on Cork Street. Waddington did not represent Liechtenstein directly, but featured his work in group exhibitions alongside Jim Dine, R.B. Kitaj, and others throughout the late 60s and 1970s. Correspondence indicates Roger's friendly relationships with Leslie Waddington, but it's less clear whether that translated into friendly terms. Waddington Custart's files indicate that the gallery made a significant profit in buying purist painting with bottles from Leo Castelli and then selling it shortly thereafter to Wolverhampton. We might speculate, lack of travel budget that might take it to New York, lack of awareness of the US art market, on why Rogers was reliant on London intermediaries in these transactions. His savvy as an operator does, though, come through in records of the 1978 Rosenquist acquisition, which required a detailed presentation to the city council to justify the acquisition, in which he writes, "The print itself is of great complexity, using up to 19 different colors over 10 separate lithographic printings with screen printed editions. It is one of an edition of 75, most of which are in American galleries. No other British gallery owns this print, and it would be a fitting acquisition to the existing collection of American pop art works by Linda Warhol and Larry Rivers. By this point, Wolverhampton's distinctive record of pop acquisitions could be used to justify further purchases. Roger's application to the V&A for match funding was rejected on the basis that we have advised that this item is too highly priced and we should not offer grant aid in this particular case. This response required or facilitated further negotiation with Petersburg Press, who offered the work at a substantial reduction, and with the note, we would all be pleased to see it in the British Museum collection, and that led to a successful application to the V&A 3 months later. These efforts brought into Wolverhampton Art Gallery works that might seem out of place, metropolitan against the Stony Pallor even. In their talk tomorrow, Mark Ronson and Ashley Gallant will discuss American photographs orphaned in British collections. In a 1975 catalogue of the Wolverhampton collection, it lists over 500 British paintings where Warhol appears as one of only 2 representatives of the American school. The other, incidentally, was Carleen Brady, a Texan best known for their art writing, whose Untitled work was presented to Wolverhampton by the Contemporary Art Society in 1972. The difficulty of explaining Jacqueline in this context is apparent in the tentative opening to Roger's description of the painting. Despite a selective bibliography of 117 items listed in John Copland's book, it is with some trepidation that one writes about a painting by Andy Warhol. For in one of his less enigmatic statements, the artist has said, "I've always had this philosophy that it really doesn't matter." As in the reference to Copland's, Rogers was clearly aware of the discourse around the Tate exhibition and the formalist strategies for establishing a portable Warhol that Moffat had developed. His text, presumably used in initial presentation of Jacqueline, goes on to suggest the use of multiple images in both portrait and subject painting was obviously a direct result of the new technique he was using, but the subjects may have played some part in his decision. The portraits were those of film stars and the images a series of stills which could, when reproduced one above the other, produce an image not unlike a roll of film. One problem here is that Jacqueline, as a silk screen of a single photograph that, as Rogers noted, appeared in other works as part of a sequence, and as a lone work in the collection, struggles to convey the key concept of the multiple. At the Tate's large-scale exhibition, critic John Russell noted that the clustering of soup cans, Brillo boxes, portraits, disasters, and flowers works had the desired cumulative impact, which cannot be achieved by a single object, however representative. As a portrait, Jacqueline does not represent the feature of Warhol's work most interesting to Rogers and the wider British framing of American pop. In his initial description of the painting, Rogers emphasizes Warhol's preoccupation with the familiar mass-produced, which manifests itself in a limited range of subjects, including newspapers, dollar bills, Coca-Cola, and Campbell's soup cans. Without that context, it's difficult to articulate the way the silkscreen of Jacqueline Kennedy from a Life magazine photograph functions as a mass multiple image. The 1978 acquisition of Rosenquist's F11, and toward the end of Rogers' time at the gallery in 1982, a Warhol Campbell's suit print, as well as works by British artists including Richard Hamilton, Peter Blake, and later Pauline Botti, would begin to do that work and enable Wolverhampton to present a coherent survey of pop art. If these are some of the difficulties or limitations of Wolverhampton's early presentation of American pop, Rogers' other work of the period suggests a more generative and productive way in which Warhol and later acquisitions found a home in Rogers' gallery. In her 1975 profile for The Guardian, Janet Watts observes that Rogers' schizophrenia, and the kind of problematic use of that term several occasions in the article, found an asylum in Wolverhampton, and his taste for juxtaposition and outlet in shows of popular art, serious exhibitions with silly things in them. In the first, of seaside souvenirs, which combined exquisite things in shell and Tunbridge ware with modern rock shaped like ladies' legs, loaves like lobsters, and a shopping bag like a pair of leatherette knickers. In the teapot show, workman's billy cans sat beside old Beau china and a precious early teapot in the shape of a quote-unquote Chinaman, when not with the other valuable stuff, but other pots in animate shapes. She then quotes Rogers' explanation that the point of these exhibitions is not simply to show the bizarre, but to relate the fine to the vulgar, to mix them so people can appreciate the fine through the common. We're catering for the people of Wolverhampton, but here's still a serious exhibition about design and social history, the way the Bank Holiday Act changed the seaside from a medicinal place for rich people. There's a lot to unpack here, not least the metropolitan expectation that an exhibition might be for a Wolverhampton audience and at the same time serious, but also the way that an attention to British popular art and design and the blurring of high, mass and fine might provide a home or context for the otherwise orphaned Warhol Jacqueline. Encountering Lavie Rivers' pop singer and Warhol's Jacqueline in the same gallery as a survey of English of tea drinking in Britain suggests the process coined by sociologist Roland Robertson of globalization, wherein global cultural forms, as pop art arguably was by this point, intersect and interact with local practices. The accession of major and significantly unique works by American pop artists brought new challenges to Wolverhampton Art Gallery, where the preponderance of the collection is made up of 19th century English painting. Purist painting with bottle status as representative of a significant phase of an American artist's work was persuasive grounds for bringing the painting to Wolverhampton, but also created a demand for it to go elsewhere. Less than 2 years after blowing the budget on his Liechtenstein, Rogers was approached by the St. Louis Art Museum to loan the work to a retrospective that would tour US galleries between May 1981 and February 1982. This is obviously a long period to be without one of our most important modern paintings, Rogers wrote to Wolverhampton Council Chairman G.F. Howells, but it is patently an important exhibition, and we're told that the artist himself is anxious to include our picture. The work went to St. Louis, Seattle, New York, and Fort Worth, but not on the European leg of the tour. Your participation in the exhibition was of great consequence in allowing me to have the very finest examples of Roy's 1970s decade work. Curator Jack Cowart wrote Rogers' successor, Brendan Flynn. The painting has since been loaned to other Liechtenstein UK exhibitions and features in A Taste of Pop, Wolverhampton's 1991 touring exhibition of its own pop art collection. In these ways, Wolverhampton Art Gallery became a significant part of the national and international discourse on and circulation of American pop art. Flynn introduces A Taste of Pop by summarizing the history explored in this paper. The pop art collection at Wolverhampton was established by the curator David Rogers, who began to purchase contemporary British and American figurative painting and sculpture in the early 1970s. Although pop had become a historical phenomenon by 1974, the decision was made to continue to purchase in this field, laying the foundation for one of the finest pop collections outside London. That self-reflexive approach was pushed further in the 2013 and 2015 Big Bang exhibitions, which explored the formation of the pop art collection and the way it's come to define the gallery's identity. One of the stories told there was about the way Rogers and other curators overcame the resistance of local councillors who objected to the use of public funds to acquire these works. That conflict generated the local newspaper articles, Tories fuming over pop art, which recorded Conservative councillor Patricia Bradley's objection to Peter Blake's cigarette pack. We are being conned by these pop artists. A 2-year-old could have done the picture, but our curator insists it's a good painting, and council reject £300 print of Soup Tin. There's a hindsight vindication of the decision to press on and fund the acquisition of a 1968 Warhol Campbell's Soup screen print through the Friends of the Wolverhampton Art Gallery, in a vast increase from £300 of the market value of the work, and in the way that from the 1990s onwards, cultural assets have been used to drive urban regeneration, as in the Triangular Gallery extension, which asserts pop's centrality to the museum's identity and makes it part of the fabric of the city. But that earlier sense of orphaned objects, whose place and purpose in a regional gallery seemed uncertain, provides a more sympathetic context for the councillors' objections. Moreover, Rogers received support as well as opposition, not least from Leisure Services Committee head Ted Lane, who Flynn characterised as having an old-style Labour approach. He wanted ordinary working people of Wolverhampton to be offered high-quality cultural experiences. From the archive, it's clear that Lane supported Rogers in his acquisition policy as meeting that demand. Lots of things in the Wolverhampton Art Gallery archival record of this period are far from clear, though. For example, was Rogers' handwritten introduction to Warhol used as a press release, wall text, pamphlet, or catalogue entry? How were Jacqueline or Purist painting with bottles initially displayed? When was the gallery's pop art collection first shown as a distinct entity separate from the permanent collection? How was it framed and what was the response? Those were some of the questions I'd hoped to answer in greater depth when embarking on this project, and while I'd anticipated challenges, I'd not reckoned with the partial nature of the accessible archive. I'm enormously grateful to curators Claire Marlowe and Carol Thompson for helping with this work. I'm very conscious that doing so was interrupting their day jobs of running a municipal gallery that serves its community. Reviewing the Warhol and Lichtenstein files recently involved, while under curatorial oversight, involved perching on a table in the main gallery while staff installed an exhibition on Black Country beats. That experience led me to reflect on the stretched resources and conflicting demands that likely prevented a more thorough archiving of the early acquisition and display of pop art. In a generous email correspondence, Hugh Bridgestock told me David Rogers was not one for local government paperwork and probably did not leave a paper trail, even of his best work, on purpose. He was a very intelligent man, but self-destructive, and would probably have been amused by your interest. By contrast, the Tate archives that I drew on in the early part of this paper are far richer and more coherent in the story they tell, and speak of the institution's organisational resources and sense of its own history. This led me to reflect on the archival trace left by our historical events and activities whose protagonists may have not seen themselves or their work as being part of the art historical mainstream. That required embracing absences and uncertainties, following the scant archive in the directions it suggested, and writing a minor but hopefully enriching history. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. I hope we've recovered from that thrilling initial panel exploring two very different approaches to archives of American art in Britain. It's my real pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker for the event, Professor Michael Leisure, who is James and Nan Wagner Farquhar Professor of History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. Michael is the author of Reframing Abstract Expressionism, Subjectivity in Painting in the 1940s, which was awarded the Charles Eldridge Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in American Art in 1996, and Looking Askance, Skepticism in American Art from Eakins to Duchamp, which won the Modernist Studies Association Prize in 2005. If you know those books, you'll know them for the depth and breadth and innovative and imaginative and creative use of archives that we find there. And that's something that really influenced my scholarship, and it's one of the reasons I'm really pleased to be welcoming Michael today. He's also the co-author with John Davis of the Terra Foundation for American Art publication, Art of the United States, 1750 to 2000, Primary Sources, which appeared in 2020, which I believe he'll be drawing on for his paper today, and a new book titled A Flood of Images, is on the way, which explores changes in pictorial form and social relations associated with the industrialization of picture production and the development of a mass market for images in the mid-19th century US. And we're looking forward to that too. So without further, I will hand over to Michael for his talk today, Problems of Primariness. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. And hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see my slide.
Yep, it's looking good.
Great, thanks. Well, I haven't had the pleasure of exploring the archives of the United States in UK collections, so I'm already learning a lot from this symposium. I have, though, as John said, spent decades working in US-based archives, beginning in graduate school with my dissertation on abstract expressionism. I spent many months all day long squinting at microfilm in the Archives of American Art offices in Boston. And I remember vividly emerging at the end of the day as if from a sensory deprivation tank and being overwhelmed by the beauty and the color of the real world. Even in winter, after hours in front of microfilm, it's an overwhelming experience. But the sensory deprivation was redeemed by imaginative relocation. Those archives and the art at their center really transported me vividly back to the world of the 1940s when that art was being made. So that combination, I think, is distinctive for our field, history of art, where obdurate things, that is works of art, can be put into contact with surviving documents of many kinds, some extremely ephemeral, to create sparks of historical insight. Both the artifacts and the related documents qualify as primary sources, and the intersection is what this slide on the screen tries to visualize. Here, let me make the image full screen. Looking at art through words or numbers or diagrams or sketches, all the forms included in that elastic term, primary sources. And conversely, looking at words through art. I hope it's hard to tell which is on top in this slide. You're looking at a letter that Georgia O'Keeffe wrote in 1916 to Alfred Stieglitz. And along with it is her watercolor Morning Sky from 1916, which was included in her first exhibition at Stieglitz's Gallery 291. So this is O'Keeffe writing very eloquently about her difficulty with words. And I'll just read a very short passage from this text. It's the part that begins in that yellow stripe, a little above center. It says, I just have to say things, you know. Words and I are not good friends at all, except with some people when I'm close to them and can feel as well as hear their response. I have to say it some way. I'm not sure how to understand those phrases. I just have to say things. I just have to say it some way. Is she saying she needs to give words to her art, however unfriendly she finds them? She may be responding to the need for supplementary language that became acute for modernist art in this period, especially in the US, which tries to break old patterns and force fresh perceptions and thoughts. And it sometimes tries to do this by frustrating the application of words to the work. Well, my thinking about archives and the primary sources that they contain moved to a new level when I became involved in a book project some years ago now, finally published last year, 2020. Here's the cover, Art of the United States, 1750 to 2000, published by the Terra Foundation, edited by Francesca Rose, and authored by John Davis and myself. This little quote on the slide tells what we propose that primary source texts can do in this volume. So it's a history that is built around primary sources from the period covered in the title. The texts gathered in this volume offer insights into the social, intellectual, cultural, and material worlds of the visual arts in the United States between 1750 and 2000. Many were written by artists, although critics, patrons, curators, and cultural commentators also have been enlisted to help illuminate the circumstances in which art was made, supported, and interpreted. So those are what we think, or what we wanted to propose primary sources can do in a volume like this. Offer insights into social, intellectual, cultural, and material worlds, and help to illuminate the circumstances in which art was made, supported, and interpreted. So if you believe that such considerations have value for understanding art, then you're likely to be interested in the contexts and the contents of archives. But if you think the value of art is the measure of its transcendence of its social, intellectual, cultural, and material worlds, then maybe archives aren't your cup of tea. Although this volume has already appeared in English, it was intended primarily for translation into multiple languages to make these documents as accessible as possible to a wide audience, especially students who don't have knowledge of English, making key documents in the history of art in the United States available broadly. Here's one more passage from the introduction that I'd just like to use to set the stage today. Like all texts about art or adjacent to it, those included in this volume are literary representations to be interpreted in tandem with the visual works related to them. Putting relevant contemporary texts into dialogue with visual artifacts can generate insight into patterns of thought, commonplace assumptions and expectations, and the social worlds in which they're mutually rooted. So the point is that archives, we're not trying to say that archives provide a secret key that open the door to understanding. They merely give us more materials to interpret alongside the works of art that may be our central focus. So the first 5 chapters of this book contain texts selected and introduced by John Davis, and they're culled from a massive documentary history of American art to 1900 that he and Sarah Burns published some time ago. I was responsible for the second 5 chapters covering the 20th century. And it's the issues that arose in compiling texts for those chapters, issues concerning primariness, that I'm going to present to you today. I'll talk about problems that arose as the selection and interpretation and introduction in writing introductory texts, as those processes unfolded in preparation for this volume. Since there's already a large number of anthologies of writings by 20th century artists, I thought a survey of those volumes would be a wise starting point. And my colleague, Lacey Barradell, a collaborator and contributor to the volume, collected the data. And here's just a sampling of some of the existing anthologies of writings by artists from the 20th century. And this isn't even a complete list. There's at least 10 or 20 more. But a first and glaring problem that became immediately apparent is the absent primary sources, which are effects of archival bias. What was deemed worthy of preservation often excluded materials related to women, people of color, queer artists, and so forth. This problem is not unique to archives. It's also evident in museum collections, and many museums, as we know, have been working to address that problem. Some museums have been addressing it by fabricating placeholders. For example, the Hermitage Museum in Amsterdam has commissioned photographs of people of color in period poses to supplement the Dutch master portraits in their collection. We didn't attempt to do anything similar to this with archival documents, although it's not hard to imagine what that would be like. We took a more conservative approach. We opted to look far and wide for materials that would acknowledge the absences and silences of the archive. And just to give you an example, I can show you this. None of the previously published anthologies on writings of the 20th century by American artists contain this letter to the Philbrook Art Center in Oklahoma from Oscar Howe, an artist of Native American descent, who was rejected for an exhibition of Native American art at the Philbrook in 1958 because his work was said to be not traditional enough. He wrote a fierce and moving letter of protest. I'll just read to the beginning. Whoever said that my paintings are not in the traditional Indian style has poor knowledge of Indian art indeed. There's much more to Indian art than pretty stylized pictures. There was also power and strength and individualism, emotional and intellectual insight in the old Indian paintings. Every bit in my paintings is a true studied fact of Indian paintings. This letter is in the collection of the University of South Dakota now. So we looked for documents like this that would help to fill some of the absences in the archive. And we also weighted heavily in the later chapters of the book, materials authored by women, people of color, and queer artists or queer authors related to works in the discussed in the volume, when those materials become abundant in the later 20th century. At the other extreme of complete neglect, the polar opposite of the absent primaries is arguably cases where primary sources are overly present, or more precisely, they're overweighted primaries, or disproportionately influential primary sources. A good example of this is the way Mark Rothko is represented in most documentary anthologies. If you look at this chart, this is a chart showing what kinds of writings were collected in all the existing anthologies of documentary sources we could find for the 20th century. And if you look at lines 834 to 846, which represent writings by Rothko, the vast majority of them are the Romantics were prompted. I mean, if my cursor is showing you the Romantics were prompted, you see how it's the primary text in most of the volumes representing Rothko. It's a short essay he published in 1947, a perfectly fine essay, pithy, literary, but there are some problems with taking it as representative of Rothko's art, I would say. First of all, it pertains to his surrealist work, the myth-making pictures of the early and mid-1940s, not his trademark work. Here, let me show you the work as it appeared in publication in Possibilities in 1947, the journal Possibilities, alongside a picture from that same year. And just to give you one passage from that text by Rothko, I think of my pictures as dramas. The shapes in the pictures are the performers. They've been created from the need for a group of actors who are able to move dramatically without embarrassment and execute gestures without shame. So that's, this text is really writing about a kind of work that precedes the mature work by Rothko that most readers of I think, a single volume collection of essential primary sources would be most interested in knowing about. The second thing to say about this essay is that Rothko disavowed it almost as he wrote it. There's a letter from him, an archival letter in the Archives of American Art. He wrote to Barnett Newman, his colleague in the New York School, saying, "I have nothing to say in words which I would stand for. I'm hardly ashamed of the things I've written in the past. This self-statement business has become a fad this season, and I cannot see myself just spreading myself with a bunch of statements everywhere I do not wish to make." So this is at the same moment he's writing the article and making paintings like this. Nonetheless, this essay has become institutionalized in teaching and in anthologies. And so we might think of it as an example of not only overweighted, but institutionalized primariness. I propose that there are better texts by Rothko that have rarely been published and that give a better insight into his trademark work. For example, this transcript of a lecture he gave at the Pratt Institute in 1958, which contains his recipe for making a painting. You see these numbers here, 1 through 7. the things that a painting requires: a clear preoccupation with death right from the start, sensuality, tension, irony, wit and play, the ephemeral and chance, hope, 10% hope to make the tragic concept more endurable. And then further down near the bottom, he says, there is more power in telling little than in telling all. There's a lot, this is an even more pithy statement that contains, I think, a lot more insight into his mature work. And so I'd advocate shifting some of the weight of representing Rothko's artistic philosophy from the Romantics are prompted to this Pratt lecture, which is held in the Getty Archive. Another variety of primariness also involves a document that's heavily weighted, but in this case, a document that's been censored to the point of misrepresentation. And maybe we could call this a case of doubled primariness, when two quite different versions of a single document come into conflict. And a pure example of this, I think, is Andy Warhol's famous interview about pop art with Gene Swenson that was published in Art News in 1963. This interview was the source of some of Warhol's most quoted statements. You can see some of them circled here. They've been circled by a reader who writes in the margins, "Are you kidding me?" Obviously, it's a skeptical reader. But these statements, I think everybody should be a machine. I think everybody should like everybody. Yes, pop art is liking things. Some of these have become iconic statements attributed to Warhol everywhere. And this text is omnipresent in anthologies. Again, I'll show you that chart of the contents of existing anthologies, and you see the "What is Pop Art" essay representing Warhol in the anthologies by Hales, Rose, Johnson, Harrison, and Wood, and so forth. But recently, Jennifer Sitchell, while writing a dissertation at the University of Chicago, discovered the original tape recording of the interview, and the extent to which the interview has been edited, not by Swenson, but by Thomas Hess, the editor of Art News at the time, became clear. The most important part of the conversation begins with the question, is pop art queer? Here I'll show you a page from the transcript of the actual recording that Jennifer Sitchell published in the Oxford Art Journal in 2018. He says, right at the very top of the page, you see, he says, "I think that the whole interview on me should be just on homosexuality." And then if you move down to the section where the blue arrow is in the center, those classic quotes are in context and they're different from the way they've been cited prior to this publication. So Swenson asked him a question and Warhol says, "Well, I think everybody should like everybody." "You mean you should like both men and women?" "Yeah." "Yeah, sexually and in every other way?" "Yeah." "And that's what pop art's about." "Yeah, it's liking things." "And liking things is being like a machine?" "Yeah, well, because you do the same thing every time. You do the same thing over and over, and you do the same." "You mean sex?" "Yeah, and everything you do without any discrimination." "Yeah, and you use things up like you use people up. And you approve of it?" "Yes, because it's all a fantasy." So as you can see, just from this short passage, Hess has edited out, against Swenson's insistence, the central thematic of homosexuality from this interview. This is an argument that Sitchell makes very convincingly in her essay. So clearly, in the wake of this discovery, any publication of this interview must use the transcript from the recording. The problem is that the distorted version originally published in Art News has become so influential in the intervening half century that it can claim status as a primary source in itself, one that has shaped the discourse on pop, as well as the production of art. The Art News version is all over the internet. I just made a screenshot to show you how you can get those iconic quotes from the original Art News interview against any kind of kitschy background you like. If you go to the right website on the internet. So moreover, the Art News interview is also an important document now in the sense that it's evidence of the suppression of queer discourse in the heyday of pop. I was struck by John's paper just a moment ago when he noted that something similar was happening in the Tate 1971 Warhol show. So there's clearly more of an archival record of this to be exposed. So this Warhol case exemplifies what I just referred to as doubled primariness. But it has elements of yet another variety of primariness in it, remediated primariness. As we move further into the 20th century, archival materials and primary sources are often in time-based media, audio or video recordings or films. And an interesting case relating to this kind of material comes from looking at Jean-Michel Basquiat and thinking about his kind of, the kind of thing that might be included by him in this anthology. He's an interesting case study of remediated primariness, I would say. So what challenges arise when we convert recorded media into textual transcripts? Basquiat did not write much about his work, but he gave several interviews. And in my view, one of the most revealing is the one conducted by Mark Miller in 1983. There's no published transcript of this interview, so we had to make one for the volume. And questions came up like, how many ums and uhs should be included? Or how much parenthetical description of the accompanying scene should be included? What's happening between the two participants as the dialogue is unfolding? Basquiat was clearly uncomfortable speaking about his work and himself. His answers were mostly curt, sometimes flippant, and the interviewer struggled to formulate questions that would bring serious responses. At one point, Basquiat started eating a sandwich and answering questions with a mouthful of food, deliberately, unintelligibly. And you can see the change in his body language and demeanor in different frames. Here's a later frame. So this is an earlier frame in the interview where everything is more relaxed and cordial. But you can see how the body language has changed here at a later moment. A clip from this interview is available on YouTube, but it edits out the section where Basquiat is eating and contemptuous of the interviewer. His performance of this contempt for the conversation is an important supplement to the informative things he often says in the conversation, despite his disregard for the whole process. So this form of primariness, remediated, arguably extends even to cases in which an autographic or a published text is transcribed or reprinted. For example, here's a printed transcription of two kinds of texts, which will lose a great deal of expressive content if they are, if they're converted into digitized text. Note that both, so one is by Georgia O'Keeffe on the left, another example of her writing. And on the right, a kind of statement, a draft of a statement that Pollock was composing for an exhibition catalog. There are, of course, obvious things about the handwriting that are interesting to note that you will lose when this is transcribed for publication. But there are also things like the dashes. Both writers, both handwritings, rely heavily on dashes. You can see in O'Keeffe's case, they're very interesting wave-like forms of varying length and varying frequency of the waves. And I'm sure that is, let's look at this one versus this one. That's indicative of something. Her dashes are also like rests between connected thoughts. Whereas if you look at Pollock's handwriting is much more, what shall we say? It's more, I don't know, it's more aggressive maybe. The dashes are longer and they're open-ended. They don't connect thoughts, they kind of end thoughts and leave thoughts open. Here's another example of handwriting that I think is interesting and will lead us into another variety of primariness encountered in the project. These are two handwritten texts, a typewritten and a handwritten text by Donald Judd. On the left is a page from the text for specific objects, classic, iconic essay by him about minimalist art, published in the mid-1960s. And on the right, a contemporary, also from the mid-1960s, review of paintings by James Brooks. These are full of corrections and revisions, which might lead us to consider this an especially revealing version of the essay, especially of specific objects, seeing what changes he's making as his thoughts are unfolding. There are not just editorial changes made for clarity or fluency, but there are changes of ideas to be pulled out here as well. So perhaps this would be the preferred one, but then an argument could be made also that the published version of this essay is the one that's more revealing because it employs illustrations in a way that might be surprising to students. That this iconic manifesto of minimalism gives the bulk of the title page to Oldenburg's soft light switches is surprising for students, I've found, and it provokes curiosity. So, the possibility of reproducing a page from the published essay might be preferable to showing that work that was unfolding in Judd's handwriting. One more thing that working on the primary sources volume made especially clear to me was the shift in attitudes towards words on the part of modern artists as the 20th century unfolded. So earlier, keep in mind that those quotations from Georgia O'Keeffe that I read earlier about her awkwardness with words, her discomfort with them, and feeling that she wasn't capable of managing them in a way that revealed her thoughts. When we get to the 1960s, there's a very different attitude towards words on the parts of many of the modernist artists of this era. And as a good example, we just saw Carolee Schneemann in Karen's paper working very effectively, powerfully with words. And I've chosen here Robert Smithson as an example of someone who's doing something similar. A museum of language in the vicinity of art, published in Art International in 1968. Just the opening sentence, I think, is useful. In the illusory babbles of language, an artist might advance specifically to get lost and to intoxicate himself in dizzying syntaxes, seeking odd intersections of meaning, strange corridors of history, unexpected echoes, unknown humors, or voids of knowledge. But this quest is risky, full of bottomless fictions and endless architectures and counter-architectures. At the end, if there is an end, are perhaps only meaningless reverberations. He's acutely aware that language is a medium, as are oil paint and marble. And artists come to that medium with a range of interests and motivations. And he's acknowledging that this is a development of this period. The significant changes in modernism that emerged in the 1960s entailed a reversal of art's relationship to words among modernist artists. Comfort with language, with its temporal unfolding, and with some array of concepts drawn from philosophy, cultural studies, and art history became the norm. Art was no longer something alien to language, but deeply embedded within it. The awkwardness that O'Keeffe professed would have looked extremely naive to the expert wordsmith artists of the younger generations in the 1960s. And the archives and primary sources relating to 20th century art document this vividly. So this is one thing that working on the primary sources volume made especially clear to me, this shift in attitudes towards words on the part of artists as modernism unfolded as the century passed on. Perhaps one more case study I'll mention. just because it's a contrast with the example of the Donald Judd case of specific objects I mentioned a minute ago, we might think when collecting essays by Charles Sanders Peirce, this is moving back to the 19th century now, if we wanted to get writings that were theoretically informative especially for modernist artists in the late 20th century, we might turn to Peirce's collected papers and publish some of those articles, especially the writings on indexicality and the variety of semiotic signs that he defined in some of his writings in the mid and late 19th century. So we could use the published form of those texts as they were originally printed as the primary source. But we have also the handwritten pages for many of the texts on those semiotic categories that Peirce was developing. And when you look at those pages, this is the place where the illustrations appear. And they're not necessarily illustrations that are meant to accompany the text in some meaningful way. There's some kind of doodling or unconscious drifting, but there's a constant presence of visualization accompanying his texts. So in this case, one might want to include, depending on one's interests, the handwritten text over the published one as a preferable form of primary source. Well, just to conclude, we're running out of time. I'll say that there's an abundance of materials to draw on when working with 20th century artists' primary sources. I'm just showing you some of the shelves in the Donald Judd archive with just Judd's writings on art. You can see up to box, I think at the bottom, there are up to 33 boxes of Judd's writings in this archive, indicating clearly the kind of riches we have to draw from. It's a difficult process making these selections, and some of the I've lost my, here it is. Some of the problems of primariness that have come up are outlined here. So I'm happy to take any kind of questions or comments about these particular themes or whatever you'd like to discuss. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael. And you have to just accept that from me in lieu of applause or as a room of smiling faces that we might have had if we'd have been able to do this in person. I thought that was a really rich and fantastic talk. And I've got lots of questions or comments, but I hope that others have too. And if you want to write those in the chat, then I will do my very best to relay them. I think that work is on the way, so get typing. And perhaps I could just start by taking, I wonder if we could kind of go back to the start of the talk, where you included the sort of framing quotes from the book with John Davis, and that idea of illuminate was really interesting to me. That the archive would, in one way or another, the purpose of the archive is in one way or another to illuminate the work of art. And I kind of saw that as a piece in a little bit with, and this is not criticism, but the kind of defensiveness around the idea that there might be another way that's to do with art as transcendent and kind of archives. But I wondered in the course of your discussion if you've not suggested a kind of more active sense of agency that the archive might have, that it might not only illuminate, but might be kind of rather more present in the history that we might want to tell about art or American art than that idea of illuminate suggests, to go to that kind of commonality that you drew out. That I'd looked at that, the Jennifer Schissel's piece on the kind of the redaction or editing of the Swenson Warhol article, and it seemed very clear to me that in that sort of transatlantic circulation of Warhol and the sense of pop, that that article was repeatedly drawn on, and it was those kind of nomic statements that seemed to be about the form of art rather than about relationships or sexuality or desire, that facilitated the kind of portable Warhol that was then packaged and presented in London and elsewhere. And if people had to look at the text as was, something quite different might have had to happen, or things might not have happened in the way that they did. That kind of question of portability, or at the time kind of palatability of what was being said, might have changed. So I guess it's a long way to just asking if Illuminate does enough really for us in terms of archives.
Right. No, a very good point. I mean, I would say Illuminate is one of the things that archives can do, but absolutely, as you say, they play a formative part in the formation of subsequent art. That is what made it very difficult to decide how to handle that interview. Because that interview, as published in Art News, has been so formative for subsequent artists, it has a life of its own. And as you say, it is perhaps the case that perhaps the original wording would have been less influential than the wording that Hess and Art News decided to go with. That's an interesting thought. It does seem like for those in power in art institutions in the period, thinking in queer terms about pop art was just not something that was easily done. So it may be that the distortion was indeed more formative than the actual text would have been. That's a very interesting thought.
That's great. And we've got questions coming in, one from David Pipscorbett, one from Emma Merkling, and maybe just before that, if I could just get one more, what people are thinking. I've not had a chance to look at the volume yet, so I may just be kind of talking out of ignorance here. I was wondering if some of what's at stake in those kind of questions of absence, or what isn't presented as a primary source for American art, is in some ways to do with kind of what we might think of a useful primary source being, that idea of the kind of teachable document, that the sense that a lot of what you're talking about with those kind of artist statements or interviews, where we've got a kind of whole presented statement made consciously on those terms, which as I think you were kind of alluding to, often is facilitated by artists having the resources, or being given the resource in terms of just the time to work and write in that way, or the kind of the opportunity to publish and speak and be heard and recorded. I was just thinking about, for example, I remember looking at applications by African-American artists to the Harman Foundation for grants, to the Guggenheim for fellowships, and that sense that you got there a kind of artist's statement in an institutional frame, but that wasn't presented as in terms of an essay. And I wonder if it's that kind of, did you, or is there scope to look, do you think about looking at that kind of document as a way of filling that absence or gap? Absolutely.
When we get to the 20th century, we get to the Harlem Renaissance and after, there's a fair amount of material to draw on. And we have some wonderful pieces. We have some papers from the American Artists Congress Against War and Fascism by artists of color, some of the debates that were carried out around the character of the Harlem Renaissance, what kind of art should represent the new Negro movement, as it was called at the time, should go along with the music. There were some wonderful documents like that we can draw on and have drawn on and included in the volume. Absolutely. I was very struck by listening to your and Karen's papers. They made me think about which figures protect their archives and which feel like their archives are insignificant. You had the curator who didn't keep very good records because he probably didn't think his work was that significant. I can imagine that that's the case for a lot of artists we would like to know much more about now, but who didn't feel like, didn't feel entitled or didn't feel important enough to bother to save their work. And even if they did, who's to know whether it would end up in a trash bin somewhere rather than in a space of preservation. There's so much chance. And there's so much psychology and other factors that figure in what gets saved alongside power, the forces of power that are controlling what gets saved. It's a very complicated process, analyzing, what we have to work with as an archive.
That's great. And it makes me think about recent literary scholarship that attentive to the idea of a kind of market in writers' papers, what gets bought by the Harry Ransom Centre, and what can be packaged to be bought. Yeah. Let's move to the questions from, maybe we could start off with David Peters' Corbett question. He says he has several, but I'm struck by how for all of you, and certainly for Michael, the archive draws out a poetic response. I wonder if this is an expression of the nature of the archive or a supplement to it. There's a compliment in there that I think we can take, Michael, or you can take. But I'm interested.
Poetic response on my part. I'm not often accused of being very poetic, so this is a novel experience for me. Let's see. Well, I think it's impossible to not be drawn in when reading someone's words like Georgia O'Keeffe's, or there's so many artists who write very movingly about what they're experiencing, what kinds of things they're trying to get into their art, that even for a hard-nosed historical analyst, it's hard not indeed to be drawn in by the poetry and respond to it and think about it as an important factor in understanding the art and the world of the person one is examining. Yeah, I think I think it's endemic to the archive. David, thanks for that comment.
And David followed that up by saying that he was thinking in particular of the opening comments on coming out of the archive into the colours of nature. Microfilm can do that to you, right? But I do think that there was something wider there, wasn't there? I took that sense of your expression of something that you're enthusiastic about. That looking at microfilm, maybe not anymore, but that occasions a kind of a poetry.
Yes, sorry.
No, yeah.
Oh no, I was going to say, I was, another thing in your paper, John, that I thought might be fun to talk more about were the practical problems that you confronted, having to have someone being paid to use their time to watch over you as you're consulting archives. The physical experience of using archives is something I think that's very much worth talking about. And indeed, coming out into even a wintry landscape, it was snowy and cold and gray, and it just looked like I was, I had entered into the rainbow after looking at microfilm all day long. But absolutely, the experience of using archives and the complications, the socially economic, the political complications of getting access to public documents, how easy we make that, or how difficult we make that, that's an issue for all of us in this field.
I remember spending a lot of time at the British Library newspaper archive in Colindale. If you know that suburb of London, I don't think it was any less grey outside of the microfilm. So I'm not sure I got that, but yeah. Emma Merkling asks, observes, "Are so interested in your reflections on Peirce. I'm fascinated by this idea of what we give weight to in subsequent analysis, which is a question the archive is always bringing us up against. What if these were just doodles? How do we decide what is relevant? Does that matter? Does this matter?"
Well, Freud would say that there are no just doodles. I think, depending on what kind of attitude you take to psychology, you'll attribute more or less importance to those scribbles. They are scribbles. I don't think they are meant in any way to illustrate the text, but it's, here's Peirce reflecting on categories of signs like icon, representations that resemble what they represent, images that resemble what they represent, or symbols or indexes. It's hard to think that whatever marks he's making are not in some way connected to those kinds of reflections. Or even if, we can't obviously know what's going on in his mind, but if we can find some kind of interesting parallels between the drawings and the reflections, the thoughts, that's the kind of interplay between text and between archival text and work of art or primary production that I think can really generate sparks to help to clarify both. So that's what I'm hoping with thinking about Peirce's scribbles. They're fascinating. The more you look at them, the more seductive they become, and the more Peirce was self-conscious about not being a visual person. He said this himself, that he thinks visually, but he can't draw. He has no talent for making images. But all his mind worked by visual analogy. He said this in his own notations, and I think in his own publications. So there's something going on there that I think is interesting and worth pursuing, but the nature of it is nebulous.
I mean, we've talked a little about digitization, or that's kind of come up and comes up in any conversation of archival work now. And you kind of were gesturing towards that. Well, could you reproduce the object itself as illustration as against transcribing it, which would obviously raise issues for the translation element of your project. But you could certainly conceive of a digital edition in which those things were happening. And I think again that. I was thinking of a project about Joseph Conrad's marginal doodles, which were extensive, and digitization's facilitated that kind of work. That far greater access to the kind of primary document in many cases. Yeah. We have another question in the chat, which I think would be helpful, really good to go to. Martina Majeska says, thank you so much for this fascinating paper, Michael. You've spoken about the problems of underrepresentation of texts by artists of color in existing anthologies. I've noticed there's also an issue of editors or archivists and curators not having a sufficient understanding of the African-American vernacular, which means some meanings and ideas get lost in translation. And I wonder if that's relevant to the Basquiat recording that you talked about. But could you say more about the artists of color and specifically Black US artists whose papers you selected for the 2020 book and what you found when researching them?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. Yeah, as I was selecting works for inclusion in this volume, I occasionally thought about the problems that these texts were going to present for translators and empathized tremendously. The text that comes to mind, oh God, it just slipped out of my mind. I had a great example I wanted to talk about. So there is I'm now blanking on which artist it was, but there is an interview where the artist is talking about, he uses the term Uncle Tomming, to refer to, so this is obviously slang for an African-American who is overly solicitous of white authorities, from, a reference to the Harriet Beecher Stowe novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's part of U.S. English. It's just one passage of many in this interview where there is a great deal of slang used, and I have no idea how translators are going to deal with that. But I think Martina is also suggesting that there might be ways in which John Davis and I were oblivious to some of the meanings that were being communicated through these texts, and that's entirely possible. That's also something that's been argued about queer materials, that there's a lot of coding in, say, the work of Rauschenberg and Johns in the 1950s, that we might be missing things that were part of a kind of period argot that are now hard to recapture. that may be the case. I think insofar as we stay in the original language, that those questions can remain open for others to dig further into at some later date. But in terms of translation, those are serious issues, serious problems. I know that the Terra group who are working on translations are doing an incredibly scrupulous job of getting experts involved and getting outside input into how effective and how literal the translations look. So I'm really confident that they're doing the best job that can be done.
That's really interesting as well. And I guess I'd ask this follow-up question, and what I don't want to do is to somehow downplay, I guess, the political angle or emphasis that Martina's placed in her question, and I guess that you're in terms of African American artists and African American vernacular, or your comments about Margery and John's queer coding. But there's also a sense, isn't there, that one of the things that we often do in archives, when if you read extensively correspondence or diaries or informal writing, is that we're kind of tuning into a semi-private language, or things that are quite impenetrable if you haven't immersed yourself in them. And one of the questions I think for archival researchers is how digestible and kind of accessible to readers who might be interested but not quite that interested. How far do you kind of keep that sense of a private language, and how far do you kind of gloss or translate it in any instance? I think is something that becomes interesting to think about.
That's a really good point. Indeed, the right to privacy of especially people of color has been something that has been discussed in recent scholarly articles about how do you acknowledge, recognize voices that have been missing from the archives without expropriating, without doing a kind of extractive use for the benefit of some for a publisher or an author or someone else who's making a career that involves using these materials. That's a really good point to put on the table.
I think that exhausts the comments in the chat, and hopefully hasn't exhausted you, Michael. That was really no. Fascinating and helpful. If there's anyone else would like to add or comment or ask, this is kind of we're getting to the last point to do so. Perhaps if anyone's formulating a question or typing one, I could just note that we'll be back tomorrow for the second part of this event. You can use the same link that you used to get here today, and we'll be starting but sort of 5 to 3, or 10 to 3 for a sort of 3 o'clock opening tomorrow, and we'll be presenting 3 papers. So Emma Merkling, who we've heard from already today, Science, Seance, Stereoscopy, the Extraordinary Archives of Margery Crandon, Mark Rawlinson and Ashley Gallant, Orphaned Images, Photographs Without Their Photobooks, and Lucy Bragnott will be presenting a paper co-written with Karen Duniak, Abstract Impressionism in the East Midlands. We'll have a question and answer session for those 3 papers, followed by a broader roundtable chaired by David Pierce-Corbett, in which we'll have to bring all the participants together to talk over ideas that have come up across the 2 days or the longer kind of duration of the project. So it doesn't look like anyone beyond some thanks in the chat. I think we're probably at time. So thank you so much to Michael, to Emma, and to Karen for their contributions today, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody back on Zoom tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.